By late 1976, serial killer Randy Kraft had a routine of murder, dumping bodies all along the roadways of Southern California. He had broken up with his long-term boyfriend, who some suspect was an accomplice and was dating someone new. The horrific murders would go on for several more years as he roamed California and at least 2 other states in this vicious rampage. In early December of 1976, a 19-year-old named Paul Joseph Fuchs went missing from Long Beach, California. While his body has never been found, his murder was attributed to Kraft when his name was found among the coded murder entries on the killer's scorecard. He was last seen at the bar called Ripples. There was a lull in the murders following Paul Fuchs' disappearance. The relationship with Jeff Seelig seemed to be going well, and he and Kraft often picked up hitchhikers to join them for adult activities. Seelig swore that Kraft was never violent with them. But Kraft could not resist killing again, and on April 16, 1978, the body of 18-year-old Marine Scott Michael Hughes was found. Kraft drugged him before partially castrating him, then strangling him to death. The victim's shoes were missing their laces, which indicates they were possibly the murder weapon. His body was found next to a freeway on-ramp in Anaheim, the same city as Disneyland. After killing again, Randy Kraft fell into the same pattern of routine murder as before. Only 2 months later, on June 11th, another body was found. 23-year-old Roland Gerald Young had his genitals removed before he was stabbed to death. His body was dumped by a freeway near San Diego, with scrapes suggesting that he had been pushed from a moving vehicle. The next victim was found on June 19th, dumped beside the Moulton Parkway in Orange County. 20-year-old Richard Allen Keith avoided the worst of Kraft's depravities. He had been drugged, bound, and strangled. He is listed as Marine Carson on the scorecard because he was abducted from the city of Carson. The pace was picking up, with less time between kills. On July 6, Kraft picked up a 23-year-old hitchhiker named Keith Arthur Klingbeil. He was plied with alcohol, then burned with the car lighter and strangled. However, he was still alive when he was found next to the I-5 freeway, but died soon after he arrived at the hospital. The body of 20-year-old Richard Anthony Crosby was found on September 29th. He had been burned with the lighter and suffocated. On November 18th of 1978, Michael Joseph Inderbieten was found by the I-605. He had also been suffocated, but in addition, he had been burned, castrated, and assaulted with a large object. Seemingly satiated for the time being, Randy Kraft did not kill again until June of 1979. On the 19th, he killed another Marine, 20-year-old Donnie Harold Chrisel. The young man had rope marks on his wrists and ankles, and he had also been burned, but the cause of death was determined to be alcohol poisoning. Part of the body of a 21-year-old English tourist named Keith Anthony Jackson was found behind a gas station in Long Beach on August 29, 1979. His body had been dismembered and stuffed into 2 trash bags reminiscent of Patrick Kearney, who had been arrested only 2 years prior. His arms and right leg were never found. Jeff Sayre disappeared on November 24th of 1979. The 15-year-old was last seen in Westminster. On February 18th, the body of a 19-year-old Marine named Mark Allen Marsh was found. He had been hitchhiking to Buena Park, which corresponds with the Marine Head BP note in the scorecard. Kraft had decapitated the young man and also cut off his hands. During the summer of 1980, Kraft visited Oregon, and while there, he continued killing. He started the entries for these kills with Portland. The body of a 17-year-old named Michael Scott O'Fallon was found near Salem. O'Fallon was still hogtied, and he had been killed by strangulation. His camera would later be found in Kraft's home. The next victim that was killed in Oregon has not been identified. The body of a 35 to 45-year-old man was found strangled to death near Woodburn. By September 1980, Kraft was back in California and showed no signs of quitting his evil habit. 19-year-old Marine Robert Loggins was found in a trash bag on September 3rd near the El Toro Marine Base. Polaroids would be found later during a search that depicted the young man in various poses in Kraft's home. He appears either unconscious or dead in the photos. In April of 1981, Kraft killed another victim in Oregon. 17-year-old Michael Cluck was found near a city called Goshen. He had been brutally beaten to death and found in a pool of his own blood. About the same time as the body was discovered, Randy Kraft was being treated for a bruised foot, most likely from kicking the teenager. On August 10th of 1981, 17-year-old Christopher Allen Williams' body was found in the San Bernardino Mountains. He had a lethal amount of drugs in his system, and tissues had been stuffed into his nostrils. On July 29th, the body of a 14-year-old named Raymond Davis and a 16-year-old named Robert Avila were found in Echo Park, California. They had both been strangled to death and were concealed under a thin layer of dirt and leaves. 24-year-old Arne Mikhail Lane was abducted on November 1st, 1982. His body was not found until January of 1984. On November 28th, the asphyxiated body of Brian Witcher was flung, partially dressed, from Kraft's vehicle on a freeway near Wilsonville, Oregon. On December 18th, the body of a 29-year-old named Anthony Jose Silvera was found near Medford, Oregon. He had been missing since December 3rd. He had been strangled to death and had a toothbrush lodged inside of him. The killer was seen wearing a military jacket with Silvera's name on it. Kraft was traveling back and forth to Oregon to work, and he seems to have always murdered during these visits. Police recognized the pattern and connected the Oregon murders to the California series. 2 days after killing Silvera, Kraft added Grand Rapids, Michigan to his hunting ground. On December 9th, 1982, the bodies of two cousins were found posed in a field near where Kraft had been staying. He had been seen talking to 24-year-old Dennis Alt and 20-year-old Christopher Schonborn on December 7th when he arrived at the hotel, and some of their belongings, as well as Silvera's jacket, were found in his hotel room. Dennis had been asphyxiated, while his cousin Christopher had a pen shoved into his urethra before he was strangled with a belt. The day after these two murders, Kraft was back in Portland. There he killed a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Lance Taggs. Taggs had been suffocated from a sock being shoved down his throat and was dumped very close to where Witcher's body had been found. The next person that Kraft killed was a 21-year-old hitchhiker named Eric Church. The young man had been drugged, bound, and beaten. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of blows to the head and ligature strangulation. On February 12, 1983, Kraft pulled another double when he picked up 18-year-old Jeffrey Nelson and 20-year-old Roger Duvall. Nelson's nude body was found only hours later. His genitals had been cut off and he had been strangled. Duvall was found the next day in San Bernardino County. He had been assaulted and strangled to death. The killing had to end at some point. After so many murders, it is mind-boggling that Kraft had not yet been caught. But on May 14, 1983, the creature's luck ran out. He was pulled over by the highway patrol after they saw him driving erratically. A drunk Randy Kraft climbed out of his car with his fly open, spilling a beer as he did so. Once the killer was in the back of the police car, arrested for drunk driving, police turned their attention to the other occupant of the car that Kraft had been driving. The slumped man in the passenger seat did not respond, and when police checked, he was dead. The 25-year-old Marine was named Terry Lee Gambrel. His hands were tied and his neck had a mark where he had been strangled to death. Police searched the car thoroughly and found the infamous scorecard, a variety of drugs, dozens of photographs depicting men either dead or unconscious, and a blood-stained carpet on the passenger side. Because Gambrel had no open wounds, they knew that Kraft had killed or badly injured other people in that car. Authorities were able to connect the entries on the list they had found to bodies, though not every one of them is connected to a murder, and some known victims are not on the list. But since it is coded, they likely just did not know the reference that Kraft had used to recall these victims. In his home, they found several victims' personal items, the room where the Polaroids had been taken, and additional photos of the victims. Randy Kraft was charged with 16 counts of murder, along with 2 other charges related to the abuse he had committed against his victims while they were alive. The trial began on September 26, 1988. Nearly 200 witnesses and more than 1,000 pieces of evidence were presented by the prosecution. Closing arguments for the prosecution alone took 3 days to read through each exhibit that pointed to Kraft's guilt. The blood, fiber, photographic, and drug evidence was overwhelming. This, along with the evidence collected regarding Kraft's location when each murder occurred, gave the jury only one choice when it came to the verdict. On May 12, 1989, Randy Kraft was found guilty on all charges. And on August 11, 1989, the jury recommended the death penalty, which was upheld by the judge 3 months later, and again by the Supreme Court in the year 2000. The main argument of Kraft's defense was that he had an alibi and evidence pointed to other killers. While this is not the case in every murder, this claim is not totally out of the realm of possibility, and some believe he had an accomplice. Some of the victims were heavy for one man to heave down an embankment. In at least one case, there were 2 sets of footprints leading to where the body was found, and there was blood type evidence in other cases. Supposedly, the prosecution even left out murders where evidence of an accomplice was strongest. But unless Randy Kraft becomes willing to give real evidence against his accomplice, it will be hard to determine who it could have been. There were 2 other prolific serial killers operating around the same time, and it is possible some victims got accidentally misattributed. Randy Kraft still sits on death row in San Quentin Prison in California as of 2022, waiting for the needle.